In 1815, Italy was merely a geographical expression, and very few people believed that one day the peninsula would become a nation-state. Yet by 1861, almost all of Italy had been unified. Around the start of the 19th century, many Europeans considered that Italy was the heartland of world civilization. Twice during the Roman Empire and at the time of the Renaissance, it had dominated Europe, first politically and then culturally. Yet the times had sadly changed, and now Italy had declined and was languishing under foreign rule or petty dictators. Italy was now more an art gallery and a museum, some believed, than a modern state. In 1796, when Napoleon's army had overrun Italy, the peninsula had comprised a complicated patchwork of states and principalities. The northern state right here of Piedmont was ruled by the House of Savoy from its capital in Turin. In 1720, the Duke of Savoy had acquired the island of Sardinia and the title of king. This joint state had originally been known as the Kingdom of Sardinia or Sardinia-Piedmont, but in the 19th century was generally referred to as Piedmont. The northern states up here, right here, of Lombardy, which was ruled by local representatives of the Austrian Empire, was supported also by an Austrian army. It is one of the most advanced parts of Italy economically, and its capital, Milan, had a population of around 130,000. Venetia, right here, was governed according to a constitution that changed little since the Renaissance and was dominated by its local aristocracy. Austria had great influence in the area. The central duchies right here, right there, were Tuscany, Modena, and Parma. They were governed by their own dukes, but again, Austria was very influential, so much so that they have been called satellite states of Austria. The ruling dynasty in Tuscany, for instance, was from the House of Lorraine, which was a part of the Habsburg family, which ruled Austria. Last or second, you have the Papal States right here. They covered most of central Italy and were governed by the Pope. Economically, the region was weak, and militarily, it relied on support from other Catholic countries. And then lastly, right here, is the Kingdom of Naples, and it was ruled by the Bourbon family, and it constituted the largest but also the poorest region in Italy. From Naples, the largest city in Italy, the king also ruled Sicily via a viceroy, which was also poverty-stricken. The combined kingdom was often referred to as the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Here's a chart that explains pre-Napoleonic Italy, just what I talked about for you to write down. In the northern states, of course, you have Piedmont, or the Kingdom of Sardinia, you have Lombardy, which is Austrian rule, and then Venetia, which is also under Austrian influence right here. In the center, you have these duchies that existed, and then in the south, you had the large Kingdom of Naples, or the Two Sicilies, ruled by the House of Bourbon, which, by the way, married heavily into the Habsburg or House of Lorraine, one or the other. The French attacked the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia in 1792, acquiring Nice and Savoy. A few years later, in 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte gained control of the army in Italy and, after a war with the Austrians in Lombardy, soon took over the whole peninsula. In 1805, Napoleon crowned himself King of Italy. Napoleon made a series of changes with simplified political boundaries. In 1798, he did away with the old complicated pattern of states and divided most of the country into 4 separate republics. In 1810, he divided the country again, but this time into 3 parts. 1/3 was annexed to France and treated as part of the French Empire. This comprised the northwest portion of Italy, including Piedmont, together with the central duchies and the Papal States. Another third became known as the Kingdom of Italy. This comprised regions of Lombardy, Modena, Bologna, Romagna, Ferrara. Napoleon was king, but his stepson ruled as viceroy. The remaining third was the Kingdom of Naples, but it did not include Sicily, which was now controlled by Great Britain, and the ruling dynasty was no longer the Bourbons. Instead, Napoleon's brother Joseph became king. Historians are very divided over what life was like for the Italian people under French rule. Not surprisingly, perhaps, since almost 20 million people then lived in the Italian peninsula. Some believe that Italy's experience during the period was traumatic from every point of view, and that the brutality and irreligion of the French soldiery were largely to blame. Certainly a great many men were required for the French army, and a great deal of money was needed to train, equip, and feed the French soldiers and the Italian conscripts. No fewer than 27,000 Italian soldiers accompanied Napoleon to Russia in 1812, but only 1,000, many of them badly wounded, survived to return home on foot, having lost all their hopes and cannon in the campaign. Italians deeply resented the increased conscription of their young men into the army, along with the high taxation needed to make good the loss of so many soldiers, horses, and weapons. War, though, was Napoleon's life, and as much as 60% of tax revenue collected in Italy by the French authorities was used to fund military expenditures, even in peacetime. Nevertheless, the experiences of different groups in Italy undoubtedly varied, as we can see by examining different sectors of Italian society under French rule. The Roman Catholic Church was one body that suffered severely. Its power was greatly reduced, and 2 popes were actually imprisoned in France. In 1809, its temporal power was declared to be at an end. The Papal States were to be governed by the French, not by the Pope and his cardinals. This did not affect the Pope's spiritual authority, for he remained head of the Church. But by 1814, almost all monasteries had been closed down by the French. In addition, the church lands were sold off, and not in small lots the peasants hoped for and might have been able to buy, but in large lots to landowning noble families or to wealthy merchants from towns who wanted to set up as a landed gentry. Whether the families of well-to-do noble landowners or of middle-class bankers and merchants, they suffered under French rule is quite unclear. Accounts vary widely, but many were written as memoirs long after the events they described, and so may not be entirely accurate. The families of 2 noblemen who later became prime ministers of Piedmont, Camille Cavour and Massimo Diaz-Glio, are good examples. The Cavours seem to have done well out of the purchase of church lands, while Diaz-Glio, in his memoirs written nearly half a century later, complained that his family was ruined under French rule. There were substantial benefits from French rule for most of the 10% or so Italians who lived in towns. The majority of these were professional men and their families, well-to-do middle-class merchants, lawyers, bankers, apothecaries, doctors, and government officials. Lower in the social scale were tradesmen, artisans, and craftsmen who profited from the increased prosperity of the middle class, as changes introduced by Napoleon brought financial and business advantages. External custom barriers were simplified, and internal trade barriers between the Italian states were swept away. Weights and measures were standardized, tax collection was reorganized, new and better roads were built, and transport was improved. The Code Napoleon was introduced nationally to replace the earlier hodgepodge of separate state laws, and new local government districts were set up along French lines. Industry was encouraged so that the French might benefit from buying cheap Italian goods, and vaccination against smallpox was made available. Street lighting in towns was introduced. At first, this caused unexpected problems. It seems that in Milan, this new attempt to make the streets safer at night was not appreciated. The flickering oil lamps are said to have quite blinded the pedestrians, making them easier targets for pickpockets and other criminals. But in the long run, there were undoubted benefits. The most important development for the future was probably the introduction by the French of the two-chamber representative government in each of the states. Many young Italian men were able to gain experience of politics and government in these parliaments. Italians absorbed French ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and some accepted that men should be citizens of a state rather than subjects of a king. Others were trained in leadership as officers in the French army or in the conscripted, well-trained Italian army of 80,000 men. These experiences were to stand both groups in good stead in the years of revolution and nationalist struggle. Meanwhile, peasant families who made up between 80 and 90% of Italians in the early 19th century continued to live a life far removed from that of the elite middle-class families of Piedmont or Tuscany or the old aristocracy of southern Italy. Italian peasant families, ignored in their lifetime and long dismissed by historians as uneducated, unimportant, non-political, and unworthy of study, are often now the focus of new research. The Italian historian Marzio Barbagalli has made an intensive study of the ages at which men and women married within the peasant communities in different parts of Italy and whether they set up their own home or lived with parents. In the rural South, Italian couples married comparatively young, women on average at 19 years of age and men shortly before they were 25. They were able to do this because the parents of a girl about to marry often supplied her with dowry gifts, including a bed, clothes, and linen. Where the families were too poor, this was usually impossible. Nevertheless, a landless laborer would often marry and set up a household with a few pence of his own and a few from his wife and whatever he could borrow and at once start a family. In Sardinia, because her father did not give a dowry, a girl had to make her with her own hands the things she needed. As she had very little time during the day, the work took a long while to complete, and the age at which she was free to marry was consequently higher than elsewhere. Many young men were never able to marry at all because it was customary in some areas that the head of the family must remain a bachelor. Most peasants lived as they had always done, in dark, damp, poorly furnished cottages that they shared with their livestock for warmth at night. They tilled their fields with wooden plows, perhaps with the help of a horse, perhaps not, and carried their crops home on their backs, since over most of rural Italy a wheeled cart was unknown. Unfortunately, the most easily and therefore most commonly grown crop was maize or corn. When eaten in large quantities as the staple diet, it results in vitamin deficiency and gives rise to the terrible disease named pellagra. In 1 year in the early 19th century, 95,000 cases were reported among the peasants in Venetia alone. Rather than remain almost permanently on the verge of starvation and the prey of bad weather and failed crops, many young men left the family farms, took to the hills, and became bandits. Many young women moved for work into town, where they often found instead diseases such as typhoid and diphtheria and tuberculosis, which are spread by overcrowding, with as many as 80 people in a house, a non-existent sewage system, and a lack of clean drinking water. Many women in both town and country discovered, if they did manage to find a job or to obtain work which could be done at home, that it was impossible to keep their babies and often abandoned them at the nearest fondling hospital. There was a container set in the front door which allowed a baby to be left with some sort of identification. If conditions improved, the mother might return and reclaim her child at a later date, months or sometimes years later, but by then the child might no longer be alive, for the death rate in fondling hospitals was high. If peasant women remained in the countryside, they were expected not only to help their husbands in the fields and to feed and care for their families, but also to make a little money at home. Often they would become outworkers for some urban merchant by spinning or weaving, sewing shirts, or, with the help of the children, raising silkworms and reeling off the silk from the resulting cocoons for the major Italian manufacturing industry of silk weaving. The effects of French rule in Italy were paradoxical. Many educated Italians were inspired by the ideas the French brought with them, some wanting to imitate France by modernizing Italy and even founding an Italian nation state. On the other hand, French rule all too often fell short of the standards it aspired to. Heavy-handed French imperialism inspired a wish in many Italians to overthrow French domination. The question was, could this be achieved? If so, would it be done by peaceful methods, including debate and agreement, or would violence be needed? Research on the Italian peasantry has revealed that historians focus on high politics and on the process that led to unification can easily mislead us into thinking that this preoccupied most Italians. But such was certainly not the case. For most Italians, life was a constant struggle for survival, and politics seemed entirely irrelevant. Two key questions arise from this. Could nationalists mobilize the peasant masses to take an interest in unification? If so, nationalism might well develop into a force to be reckoned with. Could politicians, either before or after unification, take the constructive measures that would raise the standard of living for ordinary Italians? If not, a true democracy was unlikely to evolve.